Welcome to the 43rd chapter of the book of Jeremiah. Chapter 42, we see the people that are left come to Jeremiah to seek directions, whether they should stay in Israel or should go to Egypt because of fear, that because of Ishmael killing some of the Chaldean troops that were left there, and the Gedaliah, the governor who was put in place by Nebuchadnezzar. And then at the end, Jeremiah understands that they are not going to do what God tells them to do. And 43 more or less goes more into detail on what happens. And it begins in verse 1. And it came to pass, as Jeremiah ceased speaking to the people all the words of the Lord their God, which the Lord their God sent to them, even all these words. Now that was the ones that were all there at the last chapter, and he mentions, as we see here, their God. He makes sure to explain that it is their God that they are going to go against. And that Azariah, son of Azarias, said, and Johanan, son of Kareah, and all the proud men, speaking to Jeremiah, you speak lies. The Lord our God sent you not to us to say, you should not enter into Egypt to live in there. But Baruch, the son of Neriah, unites with you against us, that you should give us into the hands of the Chaldeans to put us to death and to resettle us in Babylon. Now you question, well, why would they ever come to him in the first place and ask for what God wants to do if they're not going to accept what God says through the prophet? But such is the case, and as we mentioned in the last chapter, how many times we are told in the Word of God not to do something, but we do the opposite and then suffer the consequences. And if we sit there and wonder why, then it's just going to keep happening over and over again until we really realize the best thing to do is to give in to God and do what He says, even though sometimes it may not seem to be an easy way or the best way, but it's God's way. And God has His purposes to use us as a tool. And the tool can be used as a weapon, or it can be used something to build, something to use for farming, all sorts of things, a tool to write. He uses a man for all these different purposes. And really, I look at myself as a tool of God, and people ask me about translating the Bible. It took me like 27, 30 years. And I said, well, really what it was like, I don't remember how I did it anymore. I really don't. I almost cried yesterday when I was reading it and picking it up, and it was like, how did this come out? And it was like, I told these people, I said, well, I feel like I was an oven. And the oven was, God opened the door of the oven and put the Apostolic Bible information inside, closed the door and baked it for 30 years, opened the door, and out came the Apostolic Bible. So God uses us in ways that we don't know. But basically we need to have a heart of obedience, which these people didn't. And Johanan, son of Kareah, and all the leaders of the force, that is the military that was left over, and all the people hearkened not to the voice of the Lord to dwell in the land of Judah. Phonis, a phone is a derivative. And Johanan took, and all the leaders, the hegemonies, the hegemon, all the leaders of the army, the force, the whole of the rest of Judah, of the ones returning from out of all the nations which they were scattered there, probably nations around there, and Moabites and the Ammonites, and so maybe in Egypt and Libya and Ethiopia, where they ran to escape from Nebuchadnezzar, were coming back. And so he took all these people to dwell, all these people came to dwell in the land of Judah, the mighty men and the women and the infants remaining, and the daughters of the king, and the souls which Nebuzaradan, the chief guard, left behind, with Gedaliah son of Ahikam. So he took all of these people, the women, the mighty men, the army, the infants, the daughters of the kings, people that were left behind, and Jeremiah the prophet, and Baruch son of Neriah, and entered into Egypt. For they hearkened not to the voice of the Lord, and they entered into Taphanes. And came to pass the word of the Lord to Jeremiah in Taphanes, saying, so we know that Jeremiah ended up going with them, and probably Baruch. Taphanes. Now let's go to our map, and we'll see that Taphanes is right here. It's on the Suez Canal today. It's a ruin, and this is the Sinai Peninsula. Israel is just right over here, and they just came right across, and this is where they were going through the Sinai desert. Now we're going to go into, at the end, Heliopolis, which is here. And this is the Sun City, and this is where the rulers were staying, living, reigning, and then in Taphanes down here. And came to pass the word of the Lord to Jeremiah in Taphanes, saying, take to yourself great stones and hide them in the thresholds and the gate of the residence of Pharaoh in Taphanes, in front of the eyes of the men of Judah. So apparently Pharaoh would come from Heliopolis and had a residence there, and Jeremiah was to take these great stones. You can look this up, Taphanes, in Wikipedia, interesting article on it, but it mentions bricks, but the Greek doesn't have, these are not bricks. This is lithus, large stones. And so apparently Jeremiah takes these stones, puts them down, lays them there, and then God says, and you shall say, thus said the Lord of the forces, the God of Israel, behold, I send for and I will bring Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my bondman, and he shall put his throne upon these stones which you hid, and he shall lift the shields upon them, and he shall enter and shall strike the land of Egypt, whom for death unto death, and whom for resettlement unto resettlement, and whom for broadsword unto broadsword. And he shall kindle a fire in the houses of their gods, and shall set them on fire, and shall resettle them, and shall fumigate the land of Egypt, as the shepherd fumigates his garment, and shall go forth in peace. So the lice was in the garments, are fleas, and the fumigation process would kill these insects. And God is thus relating the people of Israel that fled to Egypt as insects, and they're going to be fumigated. And then he's going to go forth in peace. I couldn't find anything in any of the works or the articles on Nebuchadnezzar, if he actually, not actually, but if he, any writings on him going to Egypt and doing this. I couldn't find anything. If you find something, and appreciate it. And he shall break the columns of Heliopolis in Egypt, and that was like quite a ways from Taphanes. And the houses of the gods of Egypt he shall incinerate by fire. Now we do have, I'll turn a light on here, but we do have Strabo, who lived at the time of Christ, his geography. I have this is the 8th volume, and Strabo writes, and this is the English translation. I just thought it was interesting. I'd share it with you. What he saw when he came there to Heliopolis 350 years later or so, maybe 400 or 500 years later. Here are both the cities, Bubastis and the Bubastite Nome. It's a hill. And above it is the Heliopolite Nome hill. And this In this nome is Heliopolis, which is situated upon a noteworthy mound. It contains the temple of Helios and the ox Menaios, which is kept in a kind of sanctuary and is regarded among the inhabitants as God, as is Apis in Memphis. In front of the mound are lakes, which receive the overflow from the neighboring canal. The city is now entirely deserted. It contains the ancient temple constructed in the Egyptian manner, which affords many evidences of the madness and sacrilege of Cambyses, who partly by fire and partly by iron sought to outrage the temples, mutilating them and burning them to every side, just as he did with the obelisks. 2 of these, which were not completely spoiled, were brought to Rome, but others are either still there or at Thebes. The present Theospolis, some still standing, thoroughly eaten by fire, there's it is fire, and others lying on the ground. So here we see the columns, and it mentions the columns. It goes in, and the plan of the construction of the temples is as follows, and it goes on down, and I'm trying to see if there's anything about the columns, sphinxes, and so forth, but the description is very interesting by Strabo. Then it continues, and it says, he says, in Heliopolis I also saw large houses in which the priests lived. For it is said that this place in particular was in ancient times a settlement of priests who studied philosophy and astronomy. But both this organization and its pursuits have now disappeared. At Heliopolis, in fact, no one was pointed out to me as presiding over such pursuits, but only those who performed the sacrifices and explained to strangers what pertained to the sacred rites. When Aelius Gallus, the prefect, sailed up into Egypt, he was accompanied by a certain man from Alexandria, Chaeremon by name, who pretended to some knowledge of this kind, but was generally ridiculed as a boaster and ignoramus. However, at Heliopolis, the houses of the priests and schools of Plato and Evdocus were pointed out to us, for Evdocus went up to that place with Plato, and they both passed 13 years with the priests, as is stated by some writers. For since these priests excelled in their knowledge of the heavenly bodies, albeit secretive and slow to impart it, Plato and Evdocus prevailed upon them in time, and by courting their favor to let them learn some of the principles of their doctrines. But the barbarians concealed most things. However, these men did teach them the factions of the day and the night, which, running over and above the 365 days, fill out the time of the true year. But at that time the true year was unknown among the Greeks, as also many other things, until the later astrologers learned them from the men who had translated into Greek the records of the priests, and even to this day they learn their teachings, and likewise those of the Chaldeans. So this place in Heliopolis where the Jews went probably felt very safe there. It was a stronghold of the Pharaoh, and they felt they could go there and they would be safe. But God had a different plan, and when they got there, Nebuchadnezzar then came down and came against Egypt, apparently, and he broke the columns in Heliopolis, and the houses of the gods of Egypt he incinerated by fire. Now, in chapter 44, we see the word against the Jews in Egypt. So now we haven't finished with the story with these people, and in chapter 44 in our next video seminar, we'll find out what this word was that was against the Jews in Egypt. I hope you'll join us, and God bless.